I was standing under the rain when my marriage ended. Not quietly, not gently. It ended the way storms end summer evenings, suddenly, violently, and without apology. My name is Vivienne Moore. I was 32 years old that night, soaked to the bone, holding my phone in one trembling hand while my husband's car disappeared at the end of the street, its red lights dissolving into the curtain of rain as if he had never existed at all. I didn't cry at first. I remember that clearly. My body was too shocked to react, as if my heart needed permission to break. The rain kept falling, cold and relentless, sliding down my hair, my face, my dress, pooling at my feet. I stood there because I didn't know where else to go. The house behind me no longer felt like mine. The man I loved had already chosen another life. Minutes earlier, he had looked at me, not with anger, not even with guilt, but with impatience. As if I were an inconvenience he had finally decided to abandon. His words were sharp, careless, efficient. He said her name without hesitation. He said he was tired. He said he deserved happiness. And then he left me there, in the rain, like something forgotten. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world kept going. Cars passed. A light flickered on in a neighbor's window. Somewhere, a couple laughed. Somewhere else, someone was being loved. And there I was, realizing that the future I had planned with such devotion had just evaporated. I walked until my shoes filled with water, until my legs ached, until my thoughts became louder than the rain. Every step felt like a question with no answer. How did love turn into this? When did devotion become disposable? I replayed every memory, every promise, every quiet night we had spent together, searching for the moment where everything went wrong. I found nothing, only silence. By the time I reached the small bus stop at the corner of the avenue, I was shaking. Not just from the cold, but from the understanding that I was truly alone. I sat down on the wet bench, hugging my arms around myself, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I thought of calling someone, anyone, but shame wrapped around me tighter than the rain. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to admit that the love I had trusted had failed me so completely. That was when I noticed the car. It stopped slowly, carefully, as if unsure whether it belonged there. A black car, polished despite the storm, its headlights soft rather than blinding. The door opened, and a man stepped out, holding an umbrella that seemed absurdly elegant for a night like that. He didn't rush. He didn't stare. He simply looked at me with a kind of attention I hadn't felt in a long time. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady, untouched by the chaos around us. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to lie. Instead, something inside me cracked open. "I don't think so," I whispered. He didn't ask for details. He didn't offer advice. He simply held the umbrella over me, shielding me from the rain as if that small act could protect me from everything else too. In that moment, I didn't know his name. I didn't know his world. I didn't know that Sebastian Hale was a man whose life existed far beyond anything I could imagine. All I knew was that for the first time that night, someone had stopped. He offered to take me somewhere warm, somewhere safe. I hesitated, my instincts battling my exhaustion. But loneliness has a way of convincing you to trust silence more than fear. I stood, my legs unsteady, and followed him to the car, carrying nothing with me but the pieces of a life that had just collapsed. As we drove through the rain-soaked streets, I stared out the window, watching my reflection blur and disappear again and again. I didn't speak. Neither did he. Yet the silence between us felt different. Gentler, almost respectful. And somewhere deep inside me, a question began to form. Quiet, but persistent. What if this wasn't the end? What if the worst night of my life was only the beginning of something I couldn't yet understand? Sebastian didn't ask me where I wanted to go. He only asked if I trusted him enough to keep driving. I nodded, staring at my hands folded in my lap, still shaking. The warmth inside the car felt unreal, like stepping into another world while my old one dissolved behind us. I hadn't been warm in hours. I hadn't felt safe in weeks, maybe longer. We stopped in front of a quiet hotel near the river, its lights glowing softly through the rain. He parked, turned off the engine, and finally looked at me again. Up close, his face carried something I couldn't immediately name. Tired, maybe, but composed. As if he had learned long ago how to carry heavy things without letting them show. "I can get you a room," he said gently. "No expectations. You don't owe me anything." Those words undid me more than my husband's betrayal ever could, because they were clean, honest. I nodded again, unable to speak without breaking apart. He walked beside me, never too close, never too far, holding the umbrella so carefully it felt like a promise he didn't know he was making. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me instantly. The smell of clean sheets and polished wood made my chest ache with relief. Sebastian handled everything quietly, efficiently. When the key card slid across the counter, I realized how strange it was to trust a stranger more than the man I had married. At the door to my room, he stopped. "If you need anything," he said, "just call the front desk." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. "Thank you," I said. It felt inadequate. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echo of rain against the windows. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my husband's back as he walked away. I heard his voice saying her name. I felt the rain again, soaking into my skin. But between those memories, another image kept intruding. The quiet steadiness of Sebastian's presence, the way he had simply stayed when no one else did. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling across the bed. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then reality returned, heavy and unavoidable. I showered, dressed in the same clothes from the night before, and went downstairs, unsure of what I was looking for. He was there, sitting near the window, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him, eyes fixed on the river beyond the glass. When he saw me, he stood immediately, as if he had been waiting without wanting to admit it. "Good morning," he said. We talked then. Not about my husband, not about the woman. We spoke about small things, books, cities, the strange ways life pulls people apart and pushes them together again. He told me he traveled often. I told him I used to dream of leaving once. The words felt like old echoes, but they were mine again. Days passed like that. I found a temporary place to stay. I signed papers I never thought I would have to sign. I learned what silence sounds like after love leaves. And every now and then, Sebastian would appear. Not to rescue me, not to fix anything, but to sit with me in the quiet. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It was something slower. Something steadier. Something that didn't demand explanations or apologies. And that frightened me more than betrayal ever had. One evening as we walked along the river, the sky turning gold and violet above us, he stopped and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You know," he said softly, "sometimes the storm isn't punishment. Sometimes it's redirection." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the rain hadn't destroyed me, only moved me. But as I watched the water flow endlessly past us, I realized something else too. I was starting to feel something again. And that scared me more than being alone ever had. I didn't want to admit how much his presence had begun to matter to me. It felt disloyal, to my pain, to the life I had lost, even to the woman I used to be. I told myself Sebastian was just a passing kindness, a pause between disasters. But kindness has weight when you've been starving for it, and pauses can become places you don't want to leave. I learned things about him slowly, the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark. He never spoke about his wealth, never mentioned numbers or power or influence. When I asked what he did, he said he managed investments, that he had been doing it for a long time. His tone suggested it was something incidental, like breathing. Only later would I understand how carefully he had learned to live without announcing himself to the world. What I did notice was the way people responded to him. Hotel staff straightened when he entered a room. Restaurant managers greeted him with a respect that went beyond politeness. Yet with me, he was simply Sebastian, the man who listened, who remembered small details, who noticed when my voice changed in the middle of a sentence and waited instead of pushing. One afternoon, I finally gathered the courage to tell him about my husband. Not everything, just enough. I told him how love had once felt safe, how it had slowly turned into distance, how betrayal hadn't arrived screaming but whispering. I told him about the rain. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, my throat tight and my eyes burning, he said something that settled into me like a quiet truth. Being chosen doesn't always mean being loved, he said. And being left doesn't always mean you were unworthy. I cried then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the kind of crying that empties you out until there's room for something new. He handed me a handkerchief, pressed, clean, clearly unused, and looked away, giving me the dignity of privacy even in my breaking. Weeks passed. My divorce became official in a sterile office with neutral walls and polite voices. I signed my name until it no longer felt like mine. When I walked out, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt hollow. As if the finality had erased not only my marriage, but the version of myself who had believed in it. That evening, Sebastian invited me to dinner. His apartment overlooked the city, glass and light stretching endlessly in every direction. I stood near the window, suddenly aware of my reflection. Thinner, quieter, older in ways time couldn't measure. I don't belong here, I said softly. He joined me, standing close enough for warmth, far enough for choice. Belonging isn't about where you start, he said. It's about where you're allowed to stay. I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment something shifted. Not into love. Not yet. Into possibility. The first time he touched my hand, it was accidental, or at least it pretended to be. Our fingers brushed as he passed me a glass of wine. I pulled back instinctively, my heart racing, guilt flashing through me like lightning. He noticed immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "I won't cross lines you're not ready to redraw." That night, I lay awake thinking about lines, about how many I had drawn for others, how few I had drawn for myself. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my ex-husband. His voice sounded unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else now. He said he missed me. He said things weren't what he expected. He asked if we could talk. I stared at the city below, at the people moving forward without knowing my name or my story. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. "I don't think there's anything left to say," I told him. When I hung up, my hands were steady, but my heart was racing for a different reason. Because as I turned around, Sebastian was standing there, having heard nothing, yet somehow understanding everything. And I knew, with a certainty that frightened me, that the hardest part of my life wasn't behind me yet. It was changing shape. I tried to slow everything down after that. I told myself healing wasn't a race, that affection could become a crutch if leaned on too early. But emotions don't follow logic, and grief doesn't respect boundaries. The more I tried to protect myself, the more aware I became of how deeply Sebastian had already entered my life. Not as a replacement, but as a contrast to everything I had lost. We began spending time together in ways that felt almost domestic. Grocery shopping late at night, laughing quietly in empty aisles, cooking meals neither of us had the patience to perfect. Sitting on the floor with our backs against the couch, sharing stories we hadn't told anyone else. I learned that he hated loud parties, that he preferred listening to people over impressing them, that silence was something he valued because he had lived too long surrounded by noise disguised as admiration. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, softer than the storm that had broken me, he asked me why I still flinched whenever thunder rolled across the sky. I didn't answer right away. Some memories don't hurt because they're loud, but because they're precise. That night changed how I see things, I finally said. I don't trust stability anymore. He looked at me for a long moment, then spoke with careful honesty. Neither do I. That was the first crack in the armor he wore so effortlessly. He told me then about the cost of his world, about friendships built on convenience, about relationships that saw his name before his face, about being desired without being known. I realized, with a strange sense of symmetry, that we had both been abandoned, just in different ways. The first time we kissed, it wasn't planned. It happened in the kitchen, lights low, the city humming beyond the glass. I had been talking about nothing important when I noticed how close he was standing. The air shifted. I stopped mid-sentence. He hesitated, giving me time to pull away. I didn't. The kiss was slow, careful, almost reverent, as if we were both afraid that moving too fast might shatter something fragile between us. When it ended, my heart was pounding, not with excitement alone, but with fear. I don't want to be your escape, he said quietly. You're not, I replied. You're just here. We didn't rush after that. Love unfolded the way trust does, incrementally, unevenly, with setbacks and small victories. There were days I woke up missing the man who had broken me, not because I wanted him back, but because the past has a way of demanding acknowledgement before it lets you go. Sebastian never judged those days. He simply stayed. And then reality caught up with us. I found out who he really was at a charity gala I almost didn't attend. His name was announced with a reverence that made the room shift. Heads turned. Conversations paused. I stood there, frozen, listening as they spoke about his companies, his influence, his wealth. Words that felt surreal when attached to the man who folded laundry with me and burned toast without shame. I looked at him across the room, suddenly unsure of my place. He met my gaze immediately, concern flickering in his eyes. We left early. In the car, silence pressed heavily between us. I felt small again, the way I had that night in the rain. Vulnerable, exposed. You didn't tell me, I said. I wanted you to know me first, he replied. Not the version everyone else thinks they want. I believed him. But belief didn't erase doubt. Power changes dynamics. Money reshapes expectations. And love, when placed under a spotlight, doesn't always survive. That night, lying awake beside him, I wondered if I had traded one illusion for another, and for the first time since the storm, I questioned whether the path that had saved me might also be the one that could break me all over again. I woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to Sebastian's breathing beside me. It was steady, untroubled. Mine wasn't. The knowledge of who he truly was had settled into my chest overnight, heavy and unfamiliar. I had fallen in love with a man who existed quietly beside me, not with the empire that followed him like a shadow. Now the two were impossible to separate. I didn't tell him what I was thinking that morning. I kissed his cheek, thanked him for the coffee he made, and left with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Distance felt necessary, like pressing on a bruise to understand how deep it went. I told myself I needed time. What I didn't say was that I was afraid of becoming dependent again, afraid of being admired for the wrong reasons, afraid of waking up one day and realizing I had lost myself to someone else's gravity. My ex-husband chose that moment to reappear fully in my life, not with apologies this time, but with regret sharpened into desperation. He showed up outside my office, his confidence cracked, his certainty gone. He spoke about mistakes, about loneliness, about how the woman he left me for hadn't stayed. He looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You changed," he said. "I don't recognize you." I almost laughed, because I barely recognized myself either. When I told Sebastian about the encounter, I expected anger, possessiveness, something sharp. Instead, he listened, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked me. The question lingered long after the words faded, because for the first time in my life, the answer wasn't obvious. I wanted peace. I wanted dignity. I wanted a love that didn't require me to disappear. But wanting something doesn't always mean you're ready to accept it. The pressure of his world grew louder after that. Invitations arrived, events, public appearances I wasn't prepared for. I watched headlines begin to speculate, to attach my name to his with curiosity and calculation. I felt myself shrinking again, the way I had during my marriage, quietly, politely, invisibly. One night, after another event where I smiled until my face ached, I finally broke. "I can't do this," I told him. "I don't belong in your life like this." Sebastian didn't argue. He didn't reassure me with promises or distractions. He simply nodded, pain flickering across his face like a shadow passing over light. "If you need to leave," he said, "I won't stop you." That was what hurt the most. Not being held back, being trusted enough to choose. I packed a small bag that night. I told myself it was temporary, space to think, space to breathe. But as I closed the door behind me, the sound echoed like an ending I wasn't ready to name. I moved into a modest apartment across town, surrounded by strangers who didn't know my story. I walked alone again. I cooked for one. I relearned the sound of my own thoughts without his presence softening them. Some nights, the rain returned, tapping against my windows, bringing memories I couldn't outrun. And still, through the silence, one question followed me everywhere. Had I walked away from safety or from love? The rain returned the night everything finally caught up with me, not violently, not dramatically. Just a steady, patient fall against the windows, as if the sky itself was waiting for me to understand something I had been avoiding for months. I stood in the dark of my small apartment, barefoot on cold tile, listening to the sound that had once marked the end of my marriage, and now seemed determined to define my future as well. I thought about Sebastian constantly after I left. Not in the desperate way I had thought about my ex-husband after his betrayal, but in a quieter, more persistent way. I missed the way Sebastian listened without interrupting, the way he never tried to rewrite my pain into something more convenient, the way his love never asked me to perform or prove or shrink. And that was when the truth finally settled in. I hadn't left because his world was too big. I had left because for the first time in my life, I was afraid of a love that didn't hurt me. The realization felt like grief all over again, because it meant the storm hadn't only exposed my husband's betrayal, it had exposed my fear. My instinct to run when something felt real. My belief that stability was temporary and loss inevitable. I found myself walking without direction, coat pulled tight around me, the rain soaking my hair just as it had months before. My feet carried me somewhere familiar before my mind caught up. The river. Sebastian was there. He stood beneath a streetlight, hands in his pockets, staring at the water as if he had been doing so for a long time. He looked up when he sensed me, surprise flickering across his face before softening into something deeper, something restrained. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't think I deserved to," I replied. We stood there, rain falling between us, the same distance that had once felt like safety now unbearable. I told him everything then. About my fear, about my instinct to leave before being left, about how love, when it doesn't hurt, can feel like standing on unfamiliar ground. He listened, as he always did. I never wanted to be the thing that scared you, he said quietly. You weren't, I answered. You were the thing that showed me what I still had to heal. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached for my hand, not urgently, not possessively, just an invitation. I took it, feeling something inside me finally settle. We didn't rush after that. Not into declarations, not into spectacle. Love, real love, doesn't need witnesses. It needs patience. We rebuilt slowly, intentionally. I learned how to exist beside him without disappearing into him. He learned how to let me stand on my own without pulling away. Months later, on a quiet evening far from cameras and expectations, Sebastian asked me to marry him. There was no audience, no dramatic setting, just the two of us, a shared history of storms and a future neither of us needed to escape from. I said yes, not because he was a billionaire, not because my past had been cruel, but because after everything, I finally understood that love isn't proven by how much you endure. It's proven by how safe you are allowed to become. Sometimes you have to be left in the storm to learn the difference between being abandoned and being redirected. And sometimes the rain that breaks you is the same rain that washes the past away, so you can begin again, exactly where you were meant to be.